All right, let's dive into something that sounds, well, completely nuts. We're going to talk about why one of the sharpest minds in modern philosophy, a guy named Peter Van Inwagen, would tell you that the chair you're sitting on right now, it's just not there. It doesn't exist.
No, seriously. Go ahead and look at your chair. It feels solid, right? It seems like one thing. But is it? I mean, is it really a single unified object? Or is it just a bunch of parts, legs, a seat, a back, that we've just, stuck together? That question right there, that's our rabbit hole into a huge philosophical mystery. And boom, there it is, straight from the source. Now, you gotta understand, when a philosopher like Van Inwagen says something this wild, he's not just trying to get a reaction. He's not just being provocative. This is the end result of a really powerful, step-by-step argument. An argument that's going to make us question what it even means for something to be an object in the first place.
So, okay, we've got this absolutely shocking claim on the table. Now let's put on our detective hats and get to the heart of the case. What is the central mystery that could possibly lead to such a bizarre conclusion?
And it all boils down to this one big question. The special composition question. Yeah, I know, it sounds super academic, but it's actually one of the most fundamental questions you can ask. Think about it. We see collections of things everywhere. Bricks making a wall, cells making a body, atoms making a rock. The question is, at what point do those little pieces stop being just a bunch of stuff and become a new single thing? There has to be a rule, right?
Van Inwagen gives us a great way to think about this. Just picture a pile of Legos. Right now, they're just individual bricks, right? A pile of stuff. So what do you have to do to them to make them compose something new? To get them to become a spaceship? Is just piling them up enough? What about clicking them together? Or do you have to, super glue them? What's the secret sauce? What's the magic ingredient that turns parts into a whole? Okay, so before he reveals his own, kind of mind-blowing solution, then Inwagen does what any good detective would do. He rounds up the usual suspects. All the obvious, common-sense answers that we'd probably come up with first. All right, first suspect up. Contact. This is the simplest idea, right? Maybe things form a new single object whenever they're just touching each other. So if all our Legos are in a big pile, all touching, have we created a new pile object? Seems plausible, I guess, at first.
But yeah, this one falls apart pretty fast. Think about this. When two people shake hands, their hands are in contact. Their skin cells are touching. But does anyone really think that for those few seconds, a brand new two-person being just pops into existence and then vanishes when they let go? No way. So mere contact can't be the rule. That one's out.
Okay, so maybe just touching is too weak. Let's level up. What if the rule is that parts have to be fastened together? Like when you click Legos into place. That feels way more stable, much more like a real object. But, believe it or not, the same basic problem pops up. Let's go back to our handshakers. Imagine their fingers suddenly become paralyzed and they're locked together. Well, now they're fastened, right? But has this unlucky situation created a new being? Of course not. It's just two people who are now, stuck together. So fastening doesn't work either. All right, let's go for the nuclear option. The strongest possible connection we can think of. Cohesion. We're talking super glue level stuff. The parts are bonded so tightly that you can't pull them apart without breaking them. Surely this has to be the answer, right? This has to be what creates a single object. And yet, no, the logic still holds. I mean, think about how weird and awful this would be. But if you superglued two people's hands together, it doesn't magically summon a new being made of two people. It's just two people with a very, very sticky problem. So even our best, strongest, common sense answer completely fails the test. So the obvious answers are all out. They're all debunked. This is where the investigation gets really interesting. Van Inwagen now has to look at the two most extreme possibilities out there. Either things never compose to make bigger things, or they always do always. And here they are, the two polar opposites. On one side, you have nihilism. This view says the composition never happens. The only things that are truly real are the tiniest fundamental particles, the simples, nothing else. Then, on the other side, you have the total opposite, universalism. This says the composition always happens. Pick any random collection of things you can think of, say your car keys, the Eiffel Tower, and my coffee mug. Universalism says that right now, those three things automatically form a single, real, composite object. Yeah, it's pretty out there. So how does he deal with nihilism? Well, his argument is beautifully simple. It's not some complex proof, it's just an undeniable fact. He starts with one single premise: I exist. And because he knows he's made of parts, he's got organs, cells, atoms, the whole shebang, he knows he is a composite object. So if he exists, then the claim that composite objects never exist has to be false. Bo. Case closed on that one. Now, his argument against universalism is a little more involved, but it is so clever. He starts by saying, okay, I am the same person I was 10 years ago. Makes sense. But here's the thing. The actual atoms that made up his body 10 years ago, they're now scattered all over the planet. Now remember what universalism says, any collection of stuff forms an object. So those scattered atoms must still form a single object. And since universalism doesn't care about how things are arranged, it would mean that he, Peter van Inwagen, is currently a giant spread-out cloud of particles all over the globe, which is just absurd. So universalism has to be false too.
Okay, let's recap. The common sense answers didn't work. The extreme answers didn't work. We've ruled out all the suspects. So, what on earth is left? Well, after clearing the entire board of every other possibility, van Inwagen is ready to reveal his own, pretty stunning solution to the mystery.
And this is it. This is his answer. According to van Inwagen, the only time a bunch of smaller things come together to form a new, single, larger thing is when their activity constitutes a life. That's it. Not when they're touching, not when they're fastened or glued. Only when all their combined activity adds up to a living, breathing, self-sustaining organism.
Now, the consequences of this idea are absolutely huge. It completely redraws the map of what's real. So what exists? What gets to be a composite object? Well, people do. Animals, plants, anything that's a living organism. And what doesn't exist? Your chair, your desk, mountains, even planets. According to this view, those things are just collections of tiny particles arranged in a particular way. They're arranged chair-wise or mountain-wise, but they never actually combine to become a new single object.
So what's the big difference here? Why does a dog exist but a rock doesn't? Van Inwagen uses this really great metaphor. He says the parts of a living thing are caught up in a dance. Think about it. The atoms in your body aren't just sitting there. They're part of this incredibly complex, dynamic, self-sustaining process. That process is life. The atoms in your chair? They're just stuck there. There's no dance. There's no life. They're just an arrangement. But hold on. The case isn't quite closed. Because in a really fascinating twist, van Inwagen himself admits he's not totally comfortable with his own solution. And it's not because it sounds weird that chairs don't exist. No, it's because of a much deeper, more technical, philosophical problem. And that problem is vagueness. See, the concept of life isn't a sharp on or off switch. When exactly does a collection of cells become a life? When exactly does it stop being one? There are all these borderline cases, and if your rule for when objects exist depends on this fuzzy concept of life, well, that means that existence itself becomes fuzzy. It gets vague. Here's a way to think about why this is such a headache for philosophers. Forget about life for a second, and just imagine two cubes moving towards each other. When they're far apart, easy. There are two objects. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that when they touch, they become one single object. Okay, but what about that tiny fraction of a second when they're almost touching, but not quite? That borderline moment. How many objects exist in the universe right then? Is the answer 2? 1? 1.5? The idea that we can't give a definite number for how many things exist in the world, that is a really, really deep problem for philosophers like van Inwagen.
And that's really where this whole detective story leaves us. We started with what seemed like a silly question about your chair, and we've ended up staring into the abyss, questioning the very sharpness of reality itself. Now, whether you buy van Inwagen's conclusion or not, you have to admit his argument forces us to look at the world differently. It shows us that this everyday world, full of things we call objects, is a whole lot more mysterious and a whole lot less figured out than we ever thought.